Okay. Good evening, everyone. We're having a bit of some technical issues, but will not interrupt the program that Maureen's going to present. But you won't be able to see me, but I think you've seen me plenty of times, and hopefully everyone has heard. You can hear me. So good evening, and I surely hope everyone stays safe during our storm Hernando. There was so much snow, as you know, and it's kept coming. But we're now all snug and cozy in our homes, watching via Zoom our fourth lecture of the 2025-26. You can hear you just fine. Okay. Lecture series. I'm Deanna Canini, president of the Museum of Newport Irish History. Our lecture tonight is sponsored by Margaret Murray, Peg, in memory of her husband, Vincent J. Murray. And Peg is the esteemed secretary on the board of the museum. Since our last lecture in November, we hosted the Irish Consulate from Boston, who held a pop-up event at our museum with so many of our locals and members attending, answering questions and providing information about Irish citizenship, visa requirements, and work education opportunities in Ireland. We also had our annual Christmas open house in mid-December. Although the museum is closed for the season, Steve and many of our other board members have had a few special visitors. And remember, if you would like to make a special visit, please just contact us. Our next lecture is March 23 with a lecture by Sean O'Callaghan on Ireland's Basket Islands. And you'll be receiving that information. It's available now on the website to register. It's the last lecture of the series. Also, at the lecture, we will draw the winners of the Luck of the Irish raffle, and I wish good luck to all. March is upon us, and all the celebrations for Irish Heritage Month. Please check out our website for the calendar events. The highlights for the museum are the Bonny Street Cemetery Tour on March 21, Trolley Tour of Irish Newport March 22, St. Mary Cemetery Tour March 28th, and ending the month in grand style with Dancing at the 40 Steps March 29th. The museum will be open on the weekends during the month of March. And now to our main event. Our speaker this evening, returning for her third lecture, is Maureen Brady. As you read in her bio on the flyer, you understand that Ms. Brady is a very accomplished scholar, recognized with awards for leadership and academics in the field of Irish American culture. She studied and received degrees from New York University and Trinity College Dublin, and is associated with Rutgers University. Maureen is a founding member of the newly launched Irish American Society of the Jersey Shore. Maureen's presentation tells the story of James Hoban, an Irish immigrant, the son of a tenant farmer who worked directly with George Washington to design and build the White House. His journey reveals his Irish steadfastness and his devotion to his adopted land. This is a really fascinating story, and how appropriate as we celebrate our country's 250th anniversary that we recognize an Irishman influential at the time of the founding of our country. I'll ask you will all be muted and your cameras will be off. Please use the chat option for your questions, and they'll be answered at the end. So now, please welcome Maureen Brady as she presents James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who built the White House. Maureen.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you. Special thanks to Margaret Murray, who is sponsoring this talk tonight in memory of her husband, Vincent Murray. So I appreciate that sincerely, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. I'm delighted to talk about James Hoban, and as Deanna just said, it's the perfect time, the 250th celebration of our nation, to bring James Hoban out of the shadows and to bring him into more of the spotlight as one of the Irish immigrants in the early days of our country who did so much. He designed and he built the White House. And my talk explores his life from his humble beginnings in Ireland to his remarkable achievements in America, especially in association with the White House. Because, you know, it's an iconic building that we see so often on television, probably visited when we might have gone to Washington. And little did we know, it's actually designed and built by an Irishman, James Hoban. And so the question, that got me thinking about this is, how did this iconic building that represents so much to so many come to be? The White House is not only the residence of the US president, but it's a living museum. It's been called the President's House, the President's Residence, the Executive Mansion, before it was officially named the White House in 1902. And to understand where this iconic building gets its start, we have to travel across the sea to Ireland, to a town in County Kilkenny called Cuff's Grange on the estate of Lord Cuff. And that is where James Hoban was actually born. In 1755, his parents were Edward Hoban and Martha Bain, and they were tenants on the estate of Lord Dysart, who was John Cuff, and they lived on the estate of Dysart Court. Now, at the time, of course, in Ireland, they were Catholics. Catholics, according to the penal law, could not own land, so they were tenant farmers on the lands of these great estate holders. Desert Court, the building itself, was built in 1733. And there you see a picture of it on the screen of the garden side of the facade. Its architect was Edward Lovett Pierce. We'll talk about him a little bit later. But what you'll start seeing is kind of this imagery of these grand buildings in Ireland that were built in this particular style that we'll talk about in a moment. This is the front view of the building, courtesy of the Irish Architectural Archive. And when you look at the building, you start seeing these ideas of architectural, it's called Palladianism, very grand scale, symmetry. Obviously, that kind of jumps out at you right away, that everything on one side is equal to the other side. So, although this young man who was the son of a tenant farmer wouldn't necessarily have access to the inside of the house, he certainly would be walking around the grounds and seeing the outside of the house. The interior of the house was known for its amazing elegance. It had these two huge staircases that had carved balustrades, a lot of incredible carving around the building itself. And when they needed any kind of repairs, they had their own workshops on the property. And James Hoban, young James Hoban, was determined to have a skill for this kind of work, for carpentry. So he was actually given an opportunity to train and to labor in the estate workshops. He became a very skilled carpenter, a wheelwright, and a talented craftsman. So we can imagine perhaps he might have been able to see the inside of the building because he might have had to do some repairs, do some carvings with the work that he did in the workshops on the estate. Now, he was incredibly skilled and his talent was recognized, so much so that in 1775, he was awarded a place to study architectural drawing at one of Europe's finest academies, the Royal Dublin Society, the RDS, the drawing school at the Society, in fact, and the RDS continues to exist today. This was in Dublin, so he would have to leave his home in Kilkenny, travel to Dublin, which of course is the capital of Ireland. And he received his training under the tutelage of the Irish architect Thomas Ivory, who was very famous in his time. And Ivory was the master of architectural drawing, and that was something that greatly interested Hoban. He built on his carpentry training that he received at the estate by studying drawing, geometry, perspective, architecture, anything he could get his hands on to learn more about the, the expertise of architecture itself. He learned his draftsman skills, and he learned how to draw detailed architectural renderings, which would come into good stay in his future. In 1781, his mentor and teacher, Thomas Ivory, was approached by Sir William Newcomen, who commissioned him to design a building for both his residence that would also operate as a bank. This is located near Dublin Castle, which at the time was sort of the center of, the hub of the city of Dublin. And records show that James Hoban worked for Ivory on the building's design and construction. Now, what's interesting when we look at the building, and it still is there today, if you travel to Dublin or have traveled to Dublin, you might have even seen it. But what's interesting about it, if we look at an illustration from around, the time shortly after it was built in 1788, we can see it has a couple of challenges. It's on a very challenging site. It's on a corner lot, on a curved street, and a very tight amount of footage to work with. So creativity was needed to maximize the space while also creating an elegant design. And it's believed that James Hoban drew inspiration from the interior of the building when he was designing the Whitehouse. And I think when I show you the design, you'll see why. Because if you look at the interior plan of Newcomen Bank, or it was also called New Bank, you can see that he was inspired by the use of the oval shape. There's two oval rooms actually in Newcomen Bank, and this oval shape maximized the limited space in the area, but it also created a sense of scale because it drew the eye up. Hoban's oval room concept in his Whitehouse design is directly attributed to the influence of the Newcomen Bank that he worked on in Dublin. And just to kind of show you, this is pictures from a couple of years ago, but it's an office space now, so you can see sort of modern furnishings there. But at least you get this sense of scale that the oval shape kind of brings your eye up. It maximizes the use of the space. And on the right-hand side, you can actually see the ceiling of the parlor room. So it gives you this great sense of elegance. Now, Hoban worked with Thomas Ivory and several other architects in Dublin at the time. And his work was recognized by the Royal Dublin Society, and he won the Duke of Leinster Medal. And it was presented to him in November of 1780, particularly for drawings of brackets, stairs, roofs, etc. He had the option when he won this award to either accept a cash payment for the prize or to accept the medal. And he decided to accept the medal because he thought it would kind of work in his favor as he pursued his career. And he was right, because this medal now is held in the Smithsonian collection in Washington, D.C. So he was very forward thinking in his time in Ireland. Now, I'm not an architectural historian or even an architect. I'm somebody who's interested in history, but there's a couple of terms that I'm going to use, so I thought I would just kind of share them with you to kind of clarify as I refer to them. There's a particular style that Hoban embraced. It's called neoclassical style in the American description, but it's called Georgian style in Ireland and Great Britain. And of course, it's called Georgian style because it came into sort of the forefront when the King Georges, first, second, third, and fourth, held the monarchy in Great Britain. And it's a style you're probably very familiar with. They have very similar characteristics, this grandeur of scale, simple geometric forms, very dramatic columns, either domed or flat roofs. And this Georgian style, and I'll refer to it as Georgian style, this Georgian style has its foundations in Palladian design. Palladian design is based on symmetry, perspective, proportion. It was inspired by the designs of Andrea Palladio, who was a Venetian architect way back in the 1500s. So this kind of very classical, I would use that word, style, is something that James Hoban saw at play when he was living in Dublin and studying at the Royal Dublin Society. Because when he moved to Dublin in 1775, it was a time of great expansion for the city of Dublin. It was the beginning of the evolution of the city from a very cramped crowded city into a much more elegant city, the Georgian city that we know today. And I want to show you a few of the government buildings that are built in this style. Now, if any of you have visited Dublin, you may have walked past this building. It's called Parliament House. It was designed by Edward Lovett Pierce. It's right across the street from Trinity College. Today it's the Bank of Ireland, but of course, in James Hoban's time, it was the Irish Parliament. And it was designed by Edward Lovett Pierce, who I mentioned a few minutes ago had designed Des Arts Court, which was the estate that James Hoban grew up on. So as he's walking through the city of Dublin, again, he's seeing this fantastic building with these majestic columns, this beautiful symmetry. Another wonderful architect, very well known at the time and to this day, James Gandon, who designed the Custom House in Dublin, located on the Liffey River. And he did that for a specific reason. So you could see its beautiful reflection in the River Liffey, as this picture so beautifully captures. Again, symmetry, columns, Palladianism, Georgian Dublin at its finest. And last but not least, another architect that he was very much influenced by was Richard Castles. This is the Rotunda Hospital that he did. And again, you see those features, that symmetry. And imagine these are all government buildings, the British government, of course, at the time, because Ireland was a colony of Great Britain, but they're all very majestic and beautiful in their architectural structure, very grand. So James Hoban, we can imagine, was very impressed by what he was seeing as he was walking through the streets of Dublin. But being a young Catholic who was the son of a tenant farmer, there probably would have been very few commissions for him as an architect in Dublin. And so Thomas Ivory, his mentor, recommended to him that he emigrate to America, which he did in 1785. And despite all of his wonderful accomplishments in Ireland, he probably wouldn't have been able to achieve the similar things that he did when he came to America. Now, in 1785, he was already 30 years old. So he had quite a lot of experience, but he was a little bit older than most immigrants were at the time who immigrated quite young. Now, we know in 1785, his first place that he lived was in Philadelphia, because a Philadelphia newspaper carried this advertisement. It said, "Any gentleman who wishes to build in an elegant style may hear of a person properly calculated for that purpose, who can execute the joining and carpenter's business in the modern taste. Respectfully, James Hoban." And so we know from historical records, from newspaper advertisements, that he did a lot of building, mostly for private individuals. Of course, the majority of those buildings are no longer in existence. But it was in Philadelphia where he sort of got his beginnings in America. He lived in Philadelphia for about a year, working continuously, and then decided at the end of 1785 to relocate to Charleston, South Carolina, because he knew people from Ireland in Charleston. In Charleston, he set up a partnership with a fellow Irishman named Pierce Purcell, who was a master carpenter himself. And in 1790, we know that Hoban opened a architectural school because of a newspaper advertisement. And a lot of his life has to be constructed through documents, because later in his life, he had a fire in his home and many of his papers were destroyed. But we can create a very meaningful narrative about his life from so many of these advertisements and documents that still exist. So in 1790, we see an ad in a Charleston newspaper where it says several applications being made has induced him, James Hoban, to establish an evening school for the instruction of young men in architecture. From the experience he has and the testimonial approbation of one of the finest academies of arts and sciences in Europe, the Royal Dublin Society, he hopes to merit the sanction of the public. And of course, he has the medal that he won, the Duke of Leinster medal, that he can show as a artifact of that achievement and a recognition of that achievement. We do have one existing structure still in Charleston that James Hoban designed and built, and that is the Charleston County Courthouse in Charleston himself. He did design private residences as well. Sadly, most of those are his architectural accomplishments in the more residential side have been lost to time. But this prominent building, still in use as a courthouse today, um, bears his imprint. And again, when we look at it, we see those sort of reminiscent images of the buildings that he experienced in Dublin. Look at the design. It's neoclassical, Georgian, if you were to use the Irish terminology, and you have the symmetry, the columns, the triangular pediment at the top of the building. What's interesting about his time in Charleston is that George Washington visited Charleston in May of 1791. He visited for 8 days as part of his Southern tour. At the time, he was working on the creation of Federal City. Federal City is what would become Washington, D.C., and the architect of the city was Pierre Charles L'Enfant. And L'Enfant had drawn this huge plan for what he called the President's Palace. And George Washington thought it was just too much. So he decided he was going to do something different. He was going to have a competition. So when he was in Charleston, the leaders of the city gave him a tour around the city. And according to a report in the Charleston Gazette, it says, quote, Mr. James Hoban was introduced to President George Washington as a man of merit and genius under the patronage of General Moultrie and Mr. Butler. And Mr. Butler was Pierce Butler of South Carolina, who was the Irish-born senator of that state. So they introduced James Hoban to George Washington, and from stories that have been passed down, they got along very well. And George Washington told him about his idea for an architectural competition to design the president's residence. And as a matter of fact, in 1790, an official act, the Residence Act, was passed, and it was an act for establishing not only the president's residence, but the temporary and permanent seat of the government of the United States. That was passed on July 16, 1790. So it's believed that when Washington visited Charleston a year later in 1791, he chatted with Hoban, he heard about his work, he saw the Charleston courthouse, and he told Hoban about his plan for the federal city and the design of a new residence for the president. And he also told him about this competition that he was planning to host, and that the government would pay for the building of all of these sites. The building was to be located on the Potomac River, encompass an area of about 10 square miles for all of Federal City. And it would be 10 years in the pipeline that they would be given to build Federal City along with the president's residence. So when Washington visited, he decided in this competition, he explained to Hoban what his plans were. He said of the president's residence, he wanted it to be built, quote, with the sumptuousness of a palace, the convenience of a home, and the agreeableness of a country seat, suitable not for a monarch, but for a gentleman. Now, of course, we know that he had his own residence at Mount Vernon. So he wanted something where he could feel at home, but it also had the elegance of something a gentleman would be able to live in. So his hope was to create this residence that met those needs particularly, but he didn't want it to be too grand. He certainly did not want it to be a palace, as he said, not for a monarch. The prize, the competition prize would be $500, which would, of course, be a considerable sum in 1792. And it would be awarded to the winning architect, but the architect would also be given a lot, a building lot, to build a home in the new federal city. So it's believed that about 10 men entered the competition, We know there was another man from Ireland named James Diamond who entered the competition as well. And there was, interestingly, an anonymous entry. And if you look at the anonymous entry, it has some familiar features to it because it happened to look like Monticello. And that anonymous entry was, of course, later found out to be Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson didn't win, James Hoban did, because George Washington liked the design. He liked the design entered by James Hoban, which this is sort of a facsimile. And some of these designs are held by the Maryland Historical Society on their website, which is interesting if you want to go take a look at what some of the other designs for the building might look like. So in 1792, James Hoban was awarded the winning position as architect based on this design. The entry was a 3-story building with 11 bays of window. There's a pediment in the center, an entry flanked by columns. It has all the elements of Georgian Palladianism, just like those pictures of the buildings that we saw in Dublin. Symmetry, grand scale, proportion. And as a result of the win, Hoban was granted the commission, and not only for the design, but because of his building background. He was a carpenter, as I mentioned, a wheelwright, a craftsman. Um, George Washington wanted him to oversee the design as the builder as well. So he's the designer and he's the builder of the White House. And of course, he didn't build it alone. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he received $500 and he received a building lot, which he did build a home on. And he moved from Charleston to Washington, D.C. to start the work. Now, when we look at this building, architectural historians immediately see something through their trained eye, and especially Irish historians do. They see this building, Leinster House in Dublin, that was built between 1745 and 48. So a little bit before Hoban would have gotten to Dublin, but certainly would have been a site that he would see. And this is a image, a drawing that was taken from a book in 1757, John Roke's Survey of the City, Harbour Bay, and Environs of Dublin. So it wouldn't have been that long after the building was finished in 1748 where this picture was drawn. So we get this idea of what Leinster House looks like. And Leinster House was not a government building. In fact, it was a private residence. So when Hoban was thinking about the design and he was thinking about private residences in Ireland, he thought about Leinster House because it was designed for this man. His name was James Fitzgerald. He was the first Duke of Leinster, hence the name Leinster House. And him and his wife, Emily Fitzgerald, the first Duchess of Leinster. And the Duke of Leinster was the highest ranking peer of the English crown in Ireland, i.e., the wealthiest man in Ireland at the time. So he wanted his home to reflect his status in society. And this building would represent that for him. It was also at the opposite end of where Dublin Castle is. So if you're familiar with Dublin at all, Dublin Castle is sort of on the western side of the city. Leinster House is much more to the east. So by moving this building to the east, he actually moved the center of Dublin because he made that part of the city fashionable. And so if you recall, when Hoban was at the Royal Dublin Society School, the award that he won was the Duke of Leinster Medal. So two things are in his mind, of course, the beautiful building that's private residence of the highest ranking peer in Ireland, and also the fact that his medal is the Duke of Leinster Medal. Now, as I said, it was built for the house of Fitzgerald and his wife and their family. They needed a little bit of a large size house because they had 19 children who all had governesses and nannies and tutors. So it was a pretty filled house with all of those people living in it. And the Duke commissioned Richard Castles, who I had mentioned earlier, who had designed some of the beautiful government buildings in Dublin. So when Hoban's thinking about like, how am I going to design? What am I going to design? He takes inspiration. You can use that word inspiration, and we'll look at the two side by side because he's using the ideas of one of the greatest architects in Georgian Dublin, which of course is Richard Castles, who, by the way, was German. He was born in Germany. He was not Irish born, but he did spend the majority of his life in Ireland, building wonderful buildings, not only for the government, but for private residents as well. So this is Leinster House today. For those of you who have visited Dublin, you've probably walked past it on Kildare Street because in 1922, Leinster House became Ireland's parliament, which it is today. The Dáil Éireann, the Irish Parliament, and obviously you can see there's been two buildings added to the right and the left side. On the left side is the National Library of Ireland, where all of the genealogical records are found. So if you've done genealogical research, you've gone there. And on the other side is the National Museum of Ireland. So those were added in the 1800s, but the building still exists today. And so you can see in real life how much its original design looked like the design that Hoban put forward. So if we just take a second to look at the two side by side, I mean, I would think right away it jumps out to us the similarities, right? If we look in the center of the building, we have this portico, it's called. It's in the late Georgian style. The portico bisects a rectangular building with 11 windows across. Hoban's design had 11 windows across. On each side of the portico, there are 4 windows. Same for Leinster House as is for the original design of the Whitehouse. There are crowns on each window, dentil moldings. Above the portico is this triangle pediment, 3 windows beneath the pediment. And then you see the columns in the center, 4 columns in each, dividing the 3 windows. So the image of James Hoban's design in its original design is in its purest expression before any changes or additions is extremely similar to Leinster House in Ireland, which is considered the origination of his design. And after Hoban won the design and George Washington was very taken by it, he wanted to make a few changes to it. So this original design was reworked based on George Washington's input. And so what we have is this revised design. Now, as you're looking at it, you may not be able to tell, but what George Washington wanted to do was expand it, so widen it. So it was widened by about 20%. So the final result is 120% of the original plan. And as a result of widening it, which would then add to the cost, George Washington wanted to make changes to reduce cost in other ways. So he reduced it from 3 stories to 2 stories. So if we look at just a little insert there of the original design, we see the 3 stories, we see him kind of pushed down to 2 stories, which, you know, from a lot of stories by those who have lived in the White House says it makes that second floor very cramped because all of the bedrooms that would have been on that 3rd floor would now have to be pushed down to the 2nd floor, making the rooms much smaller. And you can see even with that, there's an insert of Leinster House, you still can see the similarities. So with George Washington's input, the building gets widened, but its height gets reduced. But we still see the original design very, very much similarities to Leinster House in Dublin. Now, the interior plan, the earliest I could find a good interior plan is 1803. In 1803, this is the interior first floor plan of the White House. Now, I'm sure as you're looking at this, I'm hoping something in that design is jumping out to you, of course, and it's the oval drawing room. The oval drawing room is a concept that really was not, oval rooms were not used in architecture at that time in America. And historians who are architectural historians believe that this was directly influenced by his work on the Newcomen Bank, the New Bank in Dublin, that was designed by his mentor, Thomas Ivory. Now, there would be in the original design three oval rooms, in fact. This oval room would be on the first floor. There would be, this is the oval drawing room. On the floor beneath this would be the oval diplomatic reception room, and on the floor above it would be the oval yellow room. Um, all of these rooms were entertaining rooms. And there was a feature that Washington really liked that was part of his Mount Vernon design that Hoban incorporated, and that was this over here on the right-hand side, the public audience chamber. And that's where people would come in and have public audiences with the president. And this was to the delight of the president. He loved the oval room design. He loved them being used as places to receive people, but then he also wanted this larger audience chamber because it reflected his sort of Mount Vernon roots and part of that design as well. Now, the oval room lies at the heart of this design, but what you might find interesting is that the Oval Office was not part of the White House original design. We know it today. The Oval Office is the seat of world power, but that was a 20th century design. In fact, if you look over there at the bottom right, the president's office was on the first floor. The library, as it was called, was the president's office. And the 20th century design of the Oval Office kind of reflected these rooms from the original design, but they were a much later invention. And then the president's office moved from out of the main part of the White House as well. So all of those original oval rooms were entertaining and also kind of had their roots from Dublin. Now, this picture is a painting that was done saying a vision takes form, the White House under construction. But what I liked about it is it kind of shows us a very different Washington, D.C. than we know today, because this was in a very sort of rural area that it was being built. The cornerstone for the building was laid on October 13th, 1792. And the stone was the most precious of all building material, but it was very costly to quarry and transport. So it was used sparingly. The White House had outer walls of stone backed with layers of cheaper brick, about 1 million bricks, in fact. And the bricks were made for the White House by slave women and adolescent male slaves. So when I say that James Hoban built the White House, obviously that doesn't diminish the work of all of the many hundreds of slaves, in fact, that worked on the White House, the Scottish craftsmen who also worked on it, and the many, many, many other artisans that were part of the entire construction of the White House from 1792 to about 1800 when its first residents moved in. And slaves would quarry the stone from Virginia, carry it back into Federal City, lay the foundation. It was backbreaking work. It was grueling work because it was also being built in this area that was quite far removed from everything around it. And so this was the Federal City that would grow up to be Washington, D.C. And when Washington, as I said, named Hoban as the winner of the competition, he also named him as the builder. So you could call Hoban the de facto chief architect for Federal City, though he was never formally given the title of chief architect. So as I mentioned, with the Residence Act, they had 10 years up until 1800 to finish the building of Federal City and to make the White House able to be occupied. Its first residents actually were in 1800. They were John and Abigail Adams. They were the first White House occupants. Washington never lived in the White House, though he oversaw its building. He actually lived in three houses. His first two were in New York, and then the third that he lived in was in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia was the capital of our nation while Federal City was being built. So Washington never got to live in the White House, but the first occupants were the Adams. And what's interesting, at the time that they moved into it, it was simply given the functional name, the Executive Mansion. But every president since the Adams moved into the House has occupied the White House as their primary residence. The Adams unfortunately only lived in the White House for less than a year, and actually it was only 5 months. Shortly after they moved in, Thomas Jefferson defeated Adams in his bid for reelection, and Jefferson became the third president of the United States in 1801, and on March 4th, he took up residence in the White House. And one of his first, now maybe this was sour grapes, I don't know, I'd imagine, but I had told you, had entered the competition anonymously with his design. He didn't win, James Hoban did. And the first thing he did was replace Hoban with Benjamin Henry Latrobe as the principal architect for the US government. And he was given that title. But what's interesting and kind of a fun fact is that Latrobe, recognizing the outstanding workmanship of James Hoban, he turned around and he selected James Hoban to be the superintendent of construction for Federal City. And so the two of them worked together on many, many buildings in what is today Washington, D.C. They worked on the U.S. Capitol, the Treasury Building, the Navy Building, etc. But when we think of the White House, as early as 1801, as early as the presidency of Jefferson, the White House was being changed. Because we know today that's a big topic in the news, but it wasn't even a year from its final construction when changes started being made. And Jefferson added the two colonnades, and you can see those to the right and the left of the White House. And they were actually walkways on the east and the west side. They were inspired by designs at Monticello estate. And the goal was to connect the main residence to service buildings, to enhance the functionality, the aesthetics. And so throughout the period, Jefferson made some small changes, but these were the two major changes that he really made to it. In 1814, though, Hoban would be called again to work on the White House directly, and this time to rebuild it, because during the War of 1812, the White House was burnt down by the British, and that was on August 24th. And this painting by Tom Freeman in 2004 gives us an idea of how horrific that was. And so when Madison was president, famously, we know Dolly Madison carrying that picture of George Washington out of the building as the flames engulfed it. But it was very, very badly burned. The east, the west, the north sides were all severely damaged. The south, some of that remained in good condition, but President Madison immediately asked the US government to give him permission to call on James Hoban to return to the White House and to rebuild it and to restore it. And that's exactly what he did. Hoban provided oversight to the planning, the reconstruction of the White House, and it took them 3 years to rebuild it, which was a lot shorter time than originally. First of all, he was familiar with design, and secondly, supplies were more readily at hand, and there was more money in the government coffers to be able to pay for it. Now, kind of a story comes out of this burning of the White House, in that after it was burned, it was gray, had burn marks all over it. The exterior was painted white to cover the fire's black charring of the building. And there's a misconception that this is when it began being called the White House and got its iconic name. But actually, it was first painted white in 1798 to protect the porous exterior. Remember, I said there was stone covering brick. So it was painted white with lime wash to protect the porous exterior from freezing. So even as early as that, it was known as the White House. And then it was painted with lead paint in 1818. And of course, now it has its iconic name of the White House, which was officially given to it by President Theodore Roosevelt when he began putting that name on stationery in 1901. And he directed all of the stationery to be changed to the White House. Interesting fact here, the leader of the British battalion that burned down the White House was Major General Robert Ross, an Irishman from County Down in Ireland. So an Irishman built the White House, an Irishman burned it down, and an Irishman rebuilt it. So there's some Irish DNA in the White House. Now, changes of the White House continued, after that, of course, and some of the more iconic features that we're familiar with today would also get built and restored. And James Hoban was involved in all of them. He continued to work on the White House through restorations, expansions, and redesigns. In 1823 and 1824, he was employed to add a semicircular porch known as the South Portico. This was during President Monroe's administration. He opted for a curved colonnade and six stately columns with curving flights of stairs running down each side to the grounds below. And this addition, as I said, was during President Monroe's administration. And then a few years later, Congress provided funds for a square north portico to complement the one on the south side. Hoban was in his 70s at the time, and he was engaged to take on the task. And he built that portico on the north side that we're so familiar with. That was during President Jackson's administration, but that's where heads of state drive up to enter the White House. And it's facing Pennsylvania Avenue and has become probably one of the most familiar sites that we see. Hoban was working on this and had just completed it shortly before his death in 1831. And at the time of his death, he had been involved in the building, the rebuilding, and the expansion of the White House for decades under 6 or 7 administrations. But in his obit, there was only a slight mention. It just said he designed and obtained the premium of the president's house and built and rebuilt it. That's all it said. But what I like about his obituary is that it tells us a little bit about James Hoban, the man. And I'd like to read you just a sentence or two from his obit that said, Captain James Hoban possessed a very high degree of esteem and confidence of his fellow citizens. He was hospitable, generous, and charitable. Such men are blessings to society whilst they live, and even after death, instruct by example. So that is a very, very lovely remembrance of the man, James Hoban, rather than just the architect. Now, we don't really know what James Hoban looked like. This is the only known portrait of him. It's a very small bas-relief that was done in wax about 1800. We don't know what the occasion was, but in 1959, it was found among the family's possessions. James Hoban, in his life, did get married in 1799. He had 10 children, 2 of whom were in the naval services. One became a Jesuit priest, and his son, James Hoban Jr., is the one who was believed to have the most striking resemblance to him. As a matter of fact, they said James Hoban Jr. was the spitting image of his father. He was the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. So if we look at him, we might get a sense of what James Hoban looked like. As a young man, he was probably about 30, 35 in this picture. That would have been around the age that James Hoban was when he emigrated to America. And there are other images of James Hoban. The interesting one that we use for the cover and some of the marketing material was this poster by N.C. Wyeth. He was commissioned to do a poster for the Pennsylvania Railroad that was sponsored by Congress in 1931. He called this building the White House. But notice James Hoban is in the blue forefront, and he shows him on the back of him because he didn't at that point know what he looked like. And so he's just pointing to the building, and we see President Washington to his side overseeing it. And also, finally, in 1981, he was recognized with a commemorative stamp honoring him. This was on the 150th anniversary of his death. And because, for a long time, James Hoban sort of lived in the shadows, but it's only really kind of in recent decades that his work has been more recognized. In 2008, Ireland did a memorial to him in County Kilkenny near his home in Callan, where he grew up. And you can see there's all these glass blocks with words on it, words in English and Irish, words like endurance, character, struggle, rough, polished. And this was a wonderful collaboration between the Architect Association of Ireland and the Architectural Association of the United States. And one of the American architects working on this memorial was this man, Dennis Blasky, who is James Hoban's fifth great grandson and an architect himself, and a lecturer on federal architecture where he lives in South Carolina. And just a couple of mentions, in 2021, there was a book done by the Whitehouse Historical Association and a child's book in 2023. Now, I'm going to run through the next few slides quickly, but as you know, the museum will have this on their website so you can look at it more carefully because the building itself has a life of its own. And, it's been in the news lately, obviously, because of the renovations that are underway. But the White House, from its very inception almost, changes began, as I mentioned, in 1801. And I'm going to run through some of them for you and some that you've seen already, the colonnades that Thomas Jefferson added in 1801, the north and the south portico that were added, the north portico during Jackson's time, and then the south portico during Monroe's time. The west wing, many of these changes, by the way, were very controversial at the time that they were being done. In 1902, Teddy Roosevelt added the west wing to have dedicated space for the president and his staff. But it required removal of this. These are Victorian conservatories where different exotic plants were being grown, and horticulturists and conservationists were up in arms that this would be done. But it was knocked down, and the West Wing was built under the Theodore Roosevelt administration. And then the East Wing was actually added to by FDR to house additional staff and offices. And that was during World War II. They needed more space. And the Truman balcony was very controversial because you can see it's added actually over here to the middle of the colonnades upstairs, but the Trumans wanted space for the family to be able to kind of step outside without having to go through the whole building to get outside to just get a breath of fresh air. And so Truman actually undertook the most significant changes under his time when he added the balcony, as I said, for the family. And purists argued that it really conflicted with the original Palladian design. But in the inside, overwhelming changes took place because you can see on that picture underneath, these interior renovations done in the Truman administration were pretty major. Because imagine the building at that point was 150 years old. And so the wooden beams were weakened, the outdated plumbing and electrical systems were problems. And it was all rebuilt, staying pretty true to the original footprint, but with modern materials. In the 60s, the Rose Garden, there was an original garden that was redone in the Kennedy administration. And this was done to have outside events that were able to take place and to expand the garden to make it larger. And another controversial one was in 1970 when the indoor swimming pool that was built for FDR's physical therapy was turned into the press briefing room. And of course, another one is the state dining room. The state dining room has been changed under various administrations. It received its name during Madison's administration. It's been used for receptions and luncheons, but it can only hold about 120 people. A larger room in the East Room, can hold about 250. But during the bicentennial events, it became custom to have hundreds of people in these outdoor tents. And these tents were very large. They could hold up to 600, 700 people, but they had to put in, um, uh, you know, the facilities for heating or air conditioning, facilities, restroom facilities, the ability for the chefs to be able to keep the food warm, tables, etc. And between putting them up and taking them down could cost up to $1 million. And so that led to today's rendering of what will be the White House ballroom and the new East Wing under the current administration. Now, no, all of this was very controversial, many of them during their time. And I like Stuart McLaurin, who's the president of the White House Historical Association, probably said it best when he said the White House has been shaped by the visions and priorities of its many occupants, often sparking debate due to tensions between preservation and modernization, aesthetics and functionality. Through all its changes, the White House remains a living symbol of American democracy, evolving while enduring as a national landmark. Now, I've showed you many pictures of the White House, but I'm going to show you my favorite one, this one. The White House glowing in green for St. Patrick's Day. I like to think James Hoban's Irish eyes are smiling when he looks down on his work and realizes that it has endured and that it is now recognized around the world as an iconic symbol of American freedom and democracy. So thank you all.
Wow. This is Deanna. Thank you so much, Maureen. As I said in the beginning, this would be a fascinating story. It certainly was. The only question I have, and I'm sure there'll be others that'll come through, um, did Hoban ever return to Ireland during his American career to,
No,
reestablish
that's no,
contact?
that's a great question. No, there's no record of him ever returning to Ireland, nor any of his children returning, or going to Ireland. So no, sadly not. And for a very long time, it was sort of the fact that he was an Irish immigrant who designed it was lost, I think, to history for a long time. And as you see in the 1980s and even more recently as 2008, getting a little bit more play. The Newcomen Bank in Dublin is going through a major restoration. And the hope, according to the White House Historical Association, is that they'll be able to take a part of that building and make it a permanent exhibition to James Hoban and to the White House. So I think that would be a really nice thing to see happen as well.
Do we have any other questions out there?
I see a long one, and I'm going to have to read it. It's under the new administration, we keep hearing about the construction of the new East Wing Ballroom, which is funded by private donors. But to your point, it does seem that all U.S. presidents have done renovations with controversy, included Truman's. Yes, the pool, Gerald Ford's outdoor swimming pool. Do you know if additions from past presidents were funded by Congress? Yeah, the majority of them would have been funded by Congress, and many of them would be needed to to do it, because especially during the Truman time, at that point, a lot of the beams were sagging, the heaviness of the roof over 150 years. So yeah, Congress would have funded most of it. I have never read that any of it was privately funded. Charles Collins asked, was his wife of Irish heritage? His wife, her name was Susanna Sewell. She was of a Maryland family who had been in the country for quite a long time. I think they were more of English descent. They were a Catholic family. And with his marriage to her, part of her dowry was 3 slaves. So he actually did become a slave owner. And I want to, put that into his story because that really was kind of the story of America at that time. Her family, had lands, and so they owned slaves. And those three slaves of his, we know by documents that exist, did work on the White House, and many slaves who worked on the White House were there, sort of in um, with permission of their owners, but the payment that they received were given back to their masters, their owners. They did not receive payment for it, and we do know that three of his slaves are documented as having worked on the White House. So thank you for that question, Charles.
How did you uncover this story, Maureen?
It's interesting. I was reading this was quite a while back, but I was reading a book on Dublin because I lived in Dublin and I visit frequently. And when I read that the architect of the White House was Irish, I was like fascinated. And when I researched it and found out he was from Kilkenny, I couldn't believe it because he grew up about 20 miles away from where my both of my parents were born and raised. And when I asked him if they had heard of him, they had not. And so it wasn't really known, even in Ireland, that the
Huh.
architect of the White House was Irish. So that, of course, set me on a quest to find out more about him. Are Dubliners aware that Leinster House was the inspiration for the original White House? I guess, people, there are certainly Irish architects who have taken this up as, a subject to study, who have gone to the National Library of Ireland and who have done, work on pulling out some of those records of Leinster House construction and are working with the White House Historical Society as well. So uh, yes, I guess the people who are interested in architecture are aware. I wouldn't say the general person. And actually, like if you are walking in Dublin and you're walking up, it's on Kildare Street, Leinster House, it's the Irish Parliament. When you look at it today, it might not resonate with you that it is the inspiration for the White House because what we see is with the portico, and the portico sort of changes its look somewhat. But if you look at the original design in its purest expression, it is pretty much a replica of Leinster House. So the people who are interested in these types of things, yes, they would be aware of it.
Well, thank you, Maureen. I do say, as our slide says, please, if you have any other questions for Maureen, just submit them through our email. Um, and I wish you all a safe evening. Hopefully everyone is cozy at home. But thank you, Maureen. And any other questions, please send them. Thank you, and
Thank
good
you.
night to
Thank you,
all.
everybody.
And happy March coming up. Warm
Happy
weather.
early
Thank
St.
you.
Patrick's Day.
Thank you. All right. Good night, all.